Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Paul Collins. I'm the chair of the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our monthly webinar, in which we explore some of the many facets of Iraq's history and culture. The British Institute, BISI, is the UK's only institution dedicated to advancing research and public education on Iraq's cultural heritage. So I would invite you, please, to consider supporting us by becoming a member if you're not already joined with us. We offer postdoctoral research grants to UK-based scholars and promote knowledge exchange through supporting public engagement activities across a network of UK and Iraqi universities and museums, publishing academic and popular books, and hosting conferences and public lectures, such as this one. These webinars have proved extremely popular, I'm pleased to say, and they always generate lots of questions. And I'm sure this one won't be any exception. So please do type any questions you have into the Q&A tab, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen. If you move your cursor to the bottom of the screen, you'll find Q&A. Just type in your question there, and I'll then read those questions out at the end of the talk. So our webinars over the past number of months have been given by very distinguished scholars, and today is certainly no exception. And I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Erica Hunter, who joined us on BC's council in 2018, but has a long distinguished relationship with Iraq. Until her retirement last year, Erica was senior lecturer in Eastern Christianity in the Department of History, Religions and Philosophies at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Her research interests focused on Syriac Christianity in Iraq and Syria, as well as the outreach of the Church of the East in Iran, Central Asia, Afghanistan, and China, up until around 1500. She was principal investigator for two AHRC-funded projects, the Christian Library from Turfan and the transmission of Christian texts from Turfan. And you'll be hearing a little about that today. She spent many years studying the collection of incantation bowls in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, and then published them in association with J.B. Seagull in a catalogue of Aramaic and Mandaic incantation bowls in the British Museum in 2000. Today, she'll draw on that vast knowledge and experience to talk to us about traversing time and territory, Syriac prayer amulets from northern Mesopotamia. Erica, thank you very much indeed for agreeing to give this talk today, and I very much look forward to your talk now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul, for this very kind introduction. I've had a long association with BISI. I first went out to Iraq in 1987, and I've continued my work since then, and my happiest years were spent in Iraq, a wonderful country. Traversing time and territory. Christians lived in considerable numbers in northern Mesopotamia until the opening decades of the 20th century. And I will share the screen now, and let's, is that right? Is that coming up? Right.
Yep, that's very clear.
Right. And of course, you can see the up around Mosul, Nineveh, Diyarbakir, all of this northern Kirkuk, Ashur area, and a little more detail of the area is within that roughly triangular area. So really bridging Iran, Turkey, northern Mesopotamia. In these regions, the folk were largely subsistence farmers and shepherds, and they belonged principally to the Church of the East, Religion was a very important component in the traditional societies, and the priest acted in many different roles, including the writing of prayer amulets. They wrote them for their parishioners, and priestly functions and the church functions in healing were an integral part. Monasteries such as Rabban Hormizd, still today in northern Iraq, acted as places of healings, and lunatics were taken to the famous monastery of Mar Behnam. You can see the tomb here where the saints were buried. People were taken to these monasteries. The martyrs' graves were thought to be very, very efficacious for all kinds of diseases. And we have an observation in the 1840s by James Fletcher, who saw this practice. Let's go back where the arrow is: Mosul, Nineveh, Ashur, Kirkuk, all around this area were very heavy concentrations of Christians. And this is more detailed. You can see it's where Iran, Turkey, and Iraq, their boundaries coincide. Healing and religion and medical cure were integrally related. And for example, lunatics were taken to the very famous monastery of Rabban Hormizd in Iraq, near Al-Kosh, to be incubated. At the monastery of Mar Behnam in 1840, James Fletcher saw pilgrims taking away parcels of dust from the graves of the two martyrs who gave Mar Behnam and his sister Sarah, who gave their name to the site. These graves were unfortunately blown up by ISIS in the past few years. The relics, of course, of saints and holy men were believed to be efficacious. Now, these traditions, of course, have origins far beyond that of Christianity, and not just confined to that tradition. Muslim and Jewish communities engaged in similar practices, and often there was a type of interfaith dialogue at a vernacular level. We shall see this in the paper. So in these communities, prayer amulets were a part of daily life. Apart from apart from medical application, we used in a wide range of situations: blessing crops, assistance in political feuds, in short, every conceivable problem that might crop up. The prayer amulets were penned in classical Syriac, which is the liturgical language of the Church of the East, but included many loan words from the vernacular Syriac spoken by the people that had many Persian and Arabic and Kurdish words. And a wonderful example that occurs in one of the, that's another church to show, another example that occurs in a manuscript is the Persian word dabang, revolver. You can see it here in this illustration. And in Mosul Arabic, dabang meant a man who was slow-witted, needed multiple explanations. And this loan word occurs, it's a vernacular word that has come into a classical Syriac prayer amulet, binding of guns, spears, swords, daggers, and all implements of war. So as products emanating from the societies in which they were used, they were a very rich expression of the vernacular culture. And these people used these prayer amulets in their communities until they were largely forced to leave at the beginning of the 20th century. The prayer amulets, as I hope to show, are heirs to a tradition that transgresses time and territory, linked to the incantation bowls of the late Sassanid period, and also found as far east as the Sinkiang province in Western China, where the Church of the East had dioceses until the 14th century. So let us have a look. The prayer amulets were written on paper, and this is the text of the previous, this where we get the illustration, so you can see the type of text that is written. They were written on pieces of paper, and European visitors in the early 19th century noted, often very disparagingly, that the clergy of the Church of the East wrote and sold these amulets. Now, Justin Perkins described the commissioning of a prayer amulet. He was dining with the priest when a Muslim villager came asking for an amulet to cure his sick cow, who apparently wasn't producing milk. The priest immediately recited a prayer over some salt that would be fed to the beast, and was recompensed for his labours with a small sum of money by his grateful client. This was probably a very lucrative sideline to his otherwise meagre livings. In this situation, the priest provided an oral prayer, but in other circumstances, he might have written the prayer amulet on a piece of paper, a scroll, which the client would roll or fold up. Now, very few exemplars of these, and here we have the account by Justin Perkins of what he witnessed, and of course he was horrified. Few examples of these individually tailored items have survived. They're very fragile for a start, and also they deteriorate with constant daily wear. And finally, because they are believed to be potent, people would be reluctant to part with them. So they probably were some of the items that when people left in the early 20th century to go to the Caucasus and other regions, when they left their homelands, they would have taken their prayer amulets with. They were light and portable. However, a handful of these scroll amulets have made their way to Europe, North America, and the Caucasus. And here I have two examples, one from the Bodleian Library in Oxford with the four apostles, this lovely illustration. You can see it's a strip of paper. One of my colleagues dubbed them the Beatles. They do rather look as if they're playing a guitar, the way they're drawn. And this other, much more sophisticated scroll amulet in the private collection of Elias Assad in London. So you can see the Syriac text. This unfortunately is in colour, but we will see colour later on. They always had a decorative frontispiece, and the illustrations would be in coloured inks, yellow, green, red. The prayer amulet would consist of a preface having a series of prayers, starting with the Lord's Prayer, then followed by the prayer of Adam, the prayer of angels, and then the quotation of John chapter 1, verses 1 to 5, which was considered to be a very efficacious, very important quotation. This little prayer amulet from the Bodleian then had only this prayer scroll only had two individual amulets, the Anathema of Mary, which was useful against the evil eye, and the Anathema of Mar George for all diseases. This particular scroll amulet was written for a woman. The scroll amulets are written for individuals, and they were worn or hung by individuals. It was written, and it names the individual, and the priest who wrote it calls himself dull-witted. Well, that's the sort of typical epithet they always call themselves, but he doesn't say from where he comes. He gives his name, Joseph. The woman for whom the amulet was written might have inserted the scroll into a capsule and worn it as a piece of jewellery. So they were individual items. Now, coming back to the request for the cow, the priest recited from memory the prayer amulet for his Muslim client. But on other occasions, he might have consulted a handbook. George Percy Badger talks about priests having these books that lead people astray. He might have consulted a handbook which consisted of a whole number of prayer amulets that could be used for a whole range of complaints. It was like a recipe book. These small pocket-sized codices, and this is an example of the type of codex. These small pocket codices are more common than the scroll, probably because they weren't such personal items, they were priestly items. And quite a few have found their way into various libraries in Europe and North America. In recent years, a sizable collection has come to light in libraries, public libraries in Armenia and Georgia, brought by refugees who relocated from Mesopotamia in the 19th century to the Caucasus due to the vicissitudes that hit the communities. And as I said, these were eminently portable items, so it's not surprising to find them where these communities settled. In 1912, Hermann Galantz published really the first study of these items. He published the Syriac Book of Protection, which gave the text of 4 codex handbooks, including one that's in the British Library at present and one that's in the Cambridge Library. As these examples show, and typical of the genre, many of the individual prayer amulets were illustrated with miniatures of various subject matter. Here you can see Rabban Hormizd with the rabid dog, so that's quite interesting. A particularly popular motif is that of the, and this is the sort of frontispiece that they would have, nicely, nicely sort of illustrated border, and then they would talk and they would call themselves the Book of Protection. And this is a manuscript that is in the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin. And so many of them had ride a saint slaying a demonic beast. And here we have a couple of different manuscripts now in the Mingana collection in Birmingham with George and the Dragon. George and the Dragon was a very, very popular subject, and of course is a North Mesopotamian saint. Indeed, his reputation isn't just confined to the Christian communities. Here's a wonderful picture you can see just below here. Yazidi men after 2015 having some food under this splendid, but of course very European portrayal of George and the Dragon. But so he has surpassed just his Christian connection, and of course, as we all know, is now the patron saint of England. Illustrations of the 4 apostles, which I showed previously, and here you can see a nice coloured illustration. These all come from the Berlin manuscript, also very popular, and other subject matter, a whole variety of subject matter. Elijah and Elias flanking the tree of life. Over here, we have snakes, we have pictures of scorpions, we have all sorts of illustrations. And this sort of page is typical of what these little handbooks would look like. And in fact, they wouldn't even be as large as that page. They might be 2/3 of the size that you see on the screen. Now, the function of the prayer amulets was protection. The codices termed themselves books of protection and would conventionally call on the name of Jesus. And for example, by the power of our Lord Jesus Christ, we begin to write the protection of mankind from all kinds of evil. As I said with the scroll amulets, there was a set formula of prayers, and the same happens with the codices. So they couch the prayer amulets clearly within the Christian repertoire. And the codices standardly commenced with a series of prayers, the Lord's Prayer, the prayer to our father Adam, the prayer of angels, and of course, John chapter 1, verses 1 to 5, which of course we recite at Christmas, a beautiful passage. Now, the sentiments expressed by the prayers, such as the prayer of Adam, our Lord, have mercy upon the bearer and protect her from all harm by your grace, echoes on a personal, individual level the dynamic of the liturgy, which frequently requests protection for the faithful. Protection is a theme that is repeatedly reiterated in the prayer amulets, shielding the recipient from negative or demonic forces that were believed to be responsible for misfortune in the many manifestations that afflicted people in their daily lives. And disease, of course, was considered to be a result of demonic possession. This is a very widespread concept throughout the Middle East, and not just confined to the prayer amulets. The incantation bowls from Mesopotamia, and here we have another fine example of the rider saint, and here again we just have the rider saint. Again, Ma Tamzis, I'll come back to him, but you can see the text. Of course, it would be vertical, not horizontal. Incantation bowls, and here's a fine example from the British Museum, tackle matters of health by controlling the spirits and subduing the malevolent powers that cause disease. Disease was a consequence of demoniac possession. And a typical refrain in an incantation bowl reads, again, bound and sealed, and clasped and sealed are their mouths. They are pressed by the name, pressed, trampled, stirred are all their sicknesses. I'll come back to the name in a minute, but that's the action that they're to thwart disease. Now, of course, this isn't just something that it is something that occurs in the New Testament. You have healings performed by Christ, where again illness is clearly linked with demoniac possession, such as Matthew 10:1. He summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over clean spirits with power to cast them out, to cure all kinds of diseases and sickness. The prayer amulets equate physical and mental illness with demoniac possession. And after the citation of John 1 to 5, often there was a citation of the Jewish divine names. Ahiha, Asherah, El Shaddai, Adonai, Lord Sabaoth. And these are imported into the Christian repertoire to protect against a host of malevolent powers because they were considered to be extremely potent. Another prayer amulet, which I'll return to later on in the paper, the Anathema of the Fathers of Paradise, which avails for all pains, has embedded this mechanism of protecting within the context of Christian asceticism. And it gives a long list of church fathers and martyrs, and it includes men and women whose names are directed against all abominable actions, revenge, and evil spirits, and all the wiles of cursed spirits devoted to destruction. The recitation of the names of these very eminent church fathers and male and female martyrs activated the prayer amulet's potency. The types of diseases that are mentioned are very interesting. Now, in the Cairo, so this is the sort of text that you would find on an incantation bowl, but in the prayer amulets, the actions are embedded into a Christian context. Now, we get some idea of the range of illness, of diseases that affect these communities. We have fever, horror, fear and trembling, headache, eye ache, every pain and grievous sickness. Other amulets deal with fever, bronchial infections such as pleurisy and colic. Ulcers and cramp or heartburn are also cited as ailments. Physical complaints included boils, possibly leprosy, blood noses, and back injury, though the latter I'll come back to in a little while. Dental problems were not exempt. Some amulets deal for the teeth which chatter and the binding of teeth, and I assume that's toothache. What is fascinating is that on the whole, sexual, gynecological, and obstetric problems are largely absent from these handbooks. Of course, they fell without the domain of priests, and there would have been women within the communities who would have dealt with this. So we don't have these types of ailments and treatments within these handbooks on the whole. And indeed, the prayer amulets have no counterpart to that very major genre of incantation bowls that cite a divorce writ to expel Ishtar, who was, of course, feared tremendously and preyed on women and children. And here you see in this slide the female Ishtars. Well, Ishtars was just a generic word originally and then becomes personified as this vile woman and very much feared. And she figures prominently in Jewish amulets, particularly. However, the figure does not occur in the Christian prayer amulets devoted to childbirth, and we do have a couple of them. They do have childbirth in the repertoire. There is an amulet, a prayer amulet entitled For Unspoiled Milk, but that encourages lactation in cows, not women. And I wonder whether that was the prayer amulet which the priest recited for his Muslim client who was very concerned about his cow. And of course, the cow was a major source of economy. Now, mental illnesses, as I have mentioned, were thought to be induced by demoniac possession and are the subject of quite a few prayer amulets. And particular saints would be called upon to tackle specific ailments. The Anathema of Mar Tamzis, I'll go back to that. The Anathema of Mar Tamzis was always linked with with lunacy, the spirit of the daughter of the moon, lunacy. And headaches and associated ailments fell under the aegis of diseases. There are quite a few prayer amulets devoted to earache, eye ache, and headache. The range of mental illness in the Anathema of Mar George, which I have mentioned was very popular, is equally impressive. Fear, trembling, visions, fright, bonds of magic being just a few of the malevolent entities. Some amulets were also written with specific problems in mind. The binding of false dreams, safeguards against demoniac possession during sleep, when copulation between the victim and the demon was possible. And this is a very ancient concept that we also find in the incantation bowls. Now, most of the time, the prayer amulet that was written out would have been rolled up as a scroll and placed in a metal container. But sometimes they had some prescriptions, and the English missionary William Uighur noted that they could be dipped, these little scraps of paper could be dipped into water that were drunk, or they could be burnt. Some of the prayer amulets tell us the instructions, what to do with the text. And for example, a prayer amulet, which is called for a woman in travail, commands write upon a leaf of paper and let her swallow it. Presumably the ingestion would assist the woman's labor. For cramp or heartburn, the prayer amulet instructs, bless over oil and give him to drink. An amulet dealing with boils or possibly leprosy directs bless over ashes 3 times. But these prescriptions are not, they're only an adjunct to the text, which is really the driving force. In order to vanquish the demonic entities, the prayer amulets employed a wide range of actions, and I've mentioned some of these before, but I'll mention it again, such as may they be distanced, defeated, and expelled. In their use of these verbal actions, the prayer amulets go back to the gamut of literature from late antiquity. From in the incantation bowls, we've seen this. If I go back to the text, maybe let's go through here. And you can see, may there be annulled from him all evil sorceries and evil spirits and bound. That's typical of the formulae in incantation bowls. And the verbal actions, binding, expelling, are the kernel of the prayer amulet. And they provide the essential means by which the demonic powers would be combated and conquered. This transmission is quite conservative and was not determined by the socio-religious environment in which the prayer amulet functioned. Instead, what is interesting is the adaptation to the religious template of a society is seen in the agents or the people or deities who instigated the actions. And these are dynamic and they change with the environment in which the item is used. Now, the prayer amulets from the Christian communities in northern Mesopotamia largely abandoned the very characteristic syncretism of the incantation texts, although some Jewish elements were retained, as I've mentioned, the names of God, since they were considered to be potent. Old Testament figures, and I'm here, Old Testament figures and situations that are recalled to remind God of his past acts of deliverance, often in what we call the type of paradigm debate or paradigm prayer. And here we see, I bind them by that commandment which made Adam go out from paradise and Noah from the ark. So it reminds of, harks back to the Old Testament. And it's basically Old Testament figures. The New Testament doesn't really figure. Now, and this is, of course, used in exorcism and healing. Now, analogous situations are sometimes charmingly rendered. We have an anathema of King Solomon for back injury, and recounts, and here in the red you can see the anathema of King Solomon, which is useful for back injury. And it recounts empathically how Solomon injured his back when the Holy Spirit handed him a very heavy stone during the building of the temple. So it's a little bit of a play on health and safety in these societies. Now, the citation of multiple angelic beings, that is a real feature of incantation bowls, is not that common, is not a major feature in the prayer amulet. It's personalities of the church. that have stepped into this role. A particular prayer amulet called the Anathema of the Fathers, i.e. The Anathema of the Fathers of Paradise, which is suitable for all illnesses. I've mentioned this previously, cites an impressively long list of fathers, and some of them, such as Antony, that's Antony, and you have all these very distinguished names that people would have known. Antony, of course, the 4th century ascetic in Egypt. They would have known that some, such as Antony, recall the great ascetic environment of Egypt. Others were internationally renowned figures, and we have the inclusion in some of the versions of this amulet, of the prayer amulet, of Mar John the Golden, i.e. John Chrysostom. He's called in Syriac Mar Yohanan, the Fuma Dahava, the mouth of gold. And it's interesting because Chrysostom hailed from the Chalcedonian church, which was deeply inimical to the Church of the East in its theology, but he has made his way into this prayer amulet. Many of the saints are called John, and if you can read Syriac, you'll see here Ma Yohanan, Ma Yohanan. Oh, sorry, I'll just have to shut the door. Dreadful. Many of the amulets of the saints are called John, John the Baptist and John the Evangelist, but some of them are who we would expect, but some of the saints are local characters. We have Mar John of Gielu, a town in the Hakkari, and Mar John of Urmia, of course, up near Lake Urmia. We also have Mar John of Hatra and Mar John of Hira. So there's a very strong Mesopotamian network of saints, all called Mar John, but these are regional saints and show a localized adaptation of the prayer of this prayer amulet. If anyone has any information on Mar John of Hira or Mar John of Hatra, I'd be really interested. Now, in reciting these names or listing these names, the Anathema of the Fathers of Paradise acts as an aid memoir to protect the bearer of the bearer of the prayer amulet. And the listing is long, and it acts against an equally wide listing of ills. It's found in several codices, quite a few codices, more are coming up from the 18th and 19th century, but its origins of this particular amulet's origins probably hark back already to 7th century Mesopotamia, when around 645 at the great monastery in northern Mesopotamia, it's called the Great Monastery, Bet Abe, a monk called Inanishu composed a very comprehensive anthology of monastic histories, which he entitled The Fathers of Paradise. People were really interested in what the great monastic fathers in Egypt, etc., did, and he composed an anthology. It was a very popular work in the Church of the East and was subject of commentaries even as far as Qatar. Dadishu of Qatar in the Gulf wrote a commentary on it in the 8th century. In such an environment of intense interest in these great ascetic fathers, one might consider that if the prayer amulet originated and was a derivative of the great monastic tradition for which northern Mesopotamia was renowned, citing the church, great fathers and figures of the church in combat against evil. In an analogous process, as the great ascetics and martyrs, both male and female, were tempted and thwarted demonic powers, so the mention of their names would provide similar protection for the bearer of the prayer amulet. It's a theory I have got, and I'm interested if anyone would like to comment on it. But the anathema of the fathers of paradise traveled far beyond northern Mesopotamia to Central Asia and China. And here we see where this arrow is pointing up to Turfan, where I have done a lot of work. Fragments written in Syriac and Sogdian have been found at the monastery site at Turfan, now in the Xinjiang Uighur Autonomous Province, where there, of course, is so much focus today on the Uighur communities, of whom many were Christian until the medieval period. They were presumably these prayer amulets presumably were taken as part of the outreach program of the Church of the East to its diocese and bishoprics that stretch right across through Iran, into northern Afghanistan, through Central Asia, and actually to the then capital in China at Xi'an. These great dioceses existed between 400 and 1400. So we do have 1,000 years of history in that region. At Turfan, although it is untitled, a small Sogdian is an old Iranian language, a Sogdian prayer amulet was found and has been convincingly identified by Nicholas Sims Williams as belonging to the Anathema of the Fathers of Paradise. It's tiny, 10 by 7 centimeters, 10 lines, but the fragment cites, quote, for him who possesses the amulet, end of quote, the prayers of various martyrs, including Sergius and Bacchus, great Roman military martyrs, martyred on the Euphrates in Syria, George, Syriacus, Pethion, and also great teachers, Niasai and Ephraim, who were known to be the great exponents within the church, the Syriac church, both this Church of the East and its Western counterpart, the Syrian Orthodox Church. Now, the prayers effectively, cumulatively affect the sealing of the anathema, and I quote the Sogdian amulet, prayer amulet, may this anathema book and writing be sealed. It's a tiny fragment, but really precious. Sogdian fragments were written from, Sogdian material were written from Syriac originals, but sadly we have not found the exact match to this anathema of the Fathers of Paradise amongst the more than 500 Syriac fragments, which are mostly liturgical, that were found at Turfan by the team, the German team in the opening decades of the 20th century. And this is the monastery mound that is still present today at Turfan. However, so we haven't found an exact parallel to that Sogdian fragment, but several disparate fragments, Syriac fragments, do appear to come from the Anathema of Paradise, and I have pieced them together. These were individual, and I'm afraid I don't have the technical capacity. Some people can join them nicely, but if you put them together as we did, they do actually form a folio, and they have been pieced together. And here is the text, or those are the two texts. No, sorry. And the text reads, may you remove from him illnesses and diseases, fevers and seizures, melancholy, it's a Greek loanword, and the evil eye, and all those sufferings and pains. So it's clearly some sort of prayer amulet. Amen. And here it quotes Genesis 2, chapter 2, verse 8, and as the Lord God who placed paradise in Eden, and he placed in it the great source, and divided from it were 4 rivers, Pishon, Gihon, Diklat, the Tigris, and Pirath, the Euphrates. And here, if you can read Syriac, is the Pishon, Gihon, Diklat is here, and Perat has to be is reading that when you join the manuscripts. Now, this text matches the opening of a prayer amulet in an 18th century handbook, which Gallant published as Codex B, an example of the Anathema of the Fathers. And both these two types or two versions of the Anathema are singular in commencing with the quotation of Genesis 2:8. The Anathema of the Fathers is not the only prayer amulet that we have found at Turfan, which matches Syriac materials from the 18th and 19th centuries. Two fragments, and this was the initial discovery, Syriac HT 99 on the left, and Syriac HT means Handschrift in German, so the HT, Syriac HT 33 formed a dislocated join. They were dislocated. They don't join up, unlike the other three, but proved to be from the Anathema of Ma Tamzis, and you can see the text here. I was so thrilled. We were working on the material, and we found very little New Testament material. It was citations from the New Testament, very, very, very much less than the Old Testament. And my research assistant said to me, I found a quotation from John 1:5. Well, that was like the electric light bulb went on, because I thought, what have we? And then I saw the name Ma Tamzis, and here you can see by the prayer of Ma Tamzis, and that's his name. And I realized that it was, and reading it through and looking at the text, it was a version of the Ma Tamzis amulet, prayer amulet. The text is disjointed, but it does have all the hallmarks of a prayer amulet. And this little fragment, and here, if I turned it over on the other side, you would see a cross on the back. And if you looked very carefully, you can't see it in this photo, you could see the folds where it was folded up. And this fragment was cut down and formed some sort of personal item. And this, we don't know how these were cut out from a much larger whole, but they were. And so this is a very, very precious sort of personal item, showing adaptation, recycling, reuse of a much larger piece of a much larger fragment. We don't know when it's dated, but we can place it between the 10th and the 13th century, which is the date when most of the Turfan fragments were written. So it predates by 700 or 800 years the later occurrences of the Anathema of Ma Tamzis that was still being used by the Christian communities in northern Mesopotamia. The earliest example of these 18th century, they are coming back further and further. Where we have simply, or actually a team from Leuven in Belgium have been looking at the Armenian material, and they have got the earliest copy is now 1755. But we're still looking at a good 500 years between the two, between the Turfan material and the northern Mesopotamian material. Now, in the 18th and 19th century, the Anathema of Ma Tamzis was directed against the spirit of the daughter of the moon, lunacy. And sometimes, as we've seen before, you have the rider saint combating the evils, the spirit. And you can see this, he's lancing her, he's giving her an inoculation, it looks like. This association is not present in the Turfan example, and we don't know when that arose, but it probably arose in the 16th, 15th, 16th century. But the saint, Tamzis, was clearly from northern Mesopotamia, not from Turfan. We don't know very much about him, but he's still commemorated today by the Church of the East. And another prayer amulet to Ma Tamzis on the flyleaf of a 9th century manuscript from northern Mesopotamia that is now in the British Library shows that he was known and remembered in the homeland, the Mesopotamian homeland, at a time probably contemporaneous with the prayer amulet from Turfan. So his biographical details are scant. And if anyone ever, I keep asking and I keep looking, and clergy are looking for me, I'd love to know more about him. His biographical details are scant, but his reputation as a healer traversed time and territory from northern Mesopotamia to western China. His anathema was undoubtedly imported to the distant diocese along with other prayer amulets as part of the vigorous outreach program that the Church of the East conducted from its patriarchal seat in Seleucia, Ctesiphon, and later Baghdad. These two examples, the anathema of the Fathers of Paradise and the anathema of Martamses, are just a couple examples of the tradition of prayer amulets at the monastery of Turfan, but they show a real connection between it and sister institutions in northern Mesopotamia. I'm sure that the monastery at Turfan was probably just one institution and probably a very minor institution. It's not mentioned in official church literature along the Silk Road. There must have been many monasteries en route to China. But it was a center of therapy and healing, as later on Rabban Hormizd and Mar Bechnam functioned and still do function. The prayer amulets were presumably written for the faithful who were Sogdian and Uighur speakers, not Syriac speakers, to thwart their troubles in the same way that communities later on in northern Mesopotamia used them. When the Christian communities died out in Central Asia and China in the 14th, 15th centuries, a combination of the plague, Yersinia pestis, we know this from tombstones in Kyrgyzstan, and also a conversion to Islam, the usage of prayer amulets continued in northern Mesopotamia until modern times. They were despised and denigrated by many of the European travelers and missionaries who saw them as superstitious devices. George Percy Badger complained, and I quote, "Adverse influences are believed to be destroyed by certain passages of Holy Writ which are profanely used to this end," end of quote. Instead, I've maintained that the prayer amulets attest the continuity of a rich heritage that harks back to Mesopotamia in late antiquity and then eastwards to China in the medieval period. The discovery of the prayer amulets at Turfan show that these humble, everyday vernacular items truly did transcend time and territory. Thank you very much.
Erica, thank you very much indeed. It's always such a tragedy with these online talks that you can't hear the raucous applause that would certainly be happening in normal circumstances. And we all look forward to the time when we can reconvene in person. But what a terrific talk, wonderfully wide-ranging and extraordinary, well, for me at least, opening new windows. We have, as you might expect, some questions that have come in during your talk, and I invite our audience now to type any other questions into the Q&A. But I'll begin asking Erica the first questions now. A question from Hookie Walker. It seems that the amulets are physically widespread today. Is anybody, i.e. you, or perhaps Princeton, aiming to draw up a comprehensive catalogue or write an overarching book?
Thank you, Hookie. Now that I've retired from the dreary, mundane duties that were the norm at SOAS, it is certainly something on my mind. There is a young chap who was at Oxford and who has recently gone to Berlin, Michael, I think Michael's his first name, Zellman Rocher, who has actually drawn up a comprehensive listing. I think what is important is to recognize that there are various schools of these amulets. Most of them come from Urmia, where there were very considerable communities, but there are other regions, and there are, of course, variants. It is one of the projects that I aim to do in my retirement is to write, hopefully, an authoritative book on these. And I think these items and the Turfan material has certainly added a new dimension.
Great, thank you very much. Well, we all look forward to that. So you've said it now, you'll have to do it. A question from Harriet Martin, just clarifying, if you could, the dates of the amulets and the prayer bowls. Could you just give us some framework for that?
The prayer amulets, both in the scroll form and the codex form, are basically 18th, 19th centuries. They're dating from about 1742 to the mid-19th century. The writing seems to have fallen into abeyance in the mid-19th century, possibly due to the influence of European missionaries who, of course, were horrified at what they considered to be superstitious practices. And so clergy became more reticent to share them openly, etc. So they really are basically mid-18th century, 19th century. I have heard from the Church of the East that they still do write them within the community, but they're very circumspect about this. I'm wondering if there's one against COVID. That would be very interesting, but they're adapted to all sorts of ailments. The Turfan material, we don't have a dating. I would like to get the manuscript, the 2 fragments, carbon dated. It's very expensive, and if I'm successful in a future application, we certainly will. But we would think that they fall between the 10th and the 13th centuries, when most of the Turfan material was written. They could be earlier, because we do have carbon dating of earlier liturgical material. The incantation bowls in Mesopotamia are now reliably dated through archaeological evidence to the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries. So they overlap. I mean, there were Christian communities there. There are communities using incantation bowls. The vernacular stratum overlap, and we do find, I didn't want to go into that, we do find incantation bowls that clearly have some Christian context, but that's another subject.
Thank you. And then Natalie May asks, are there amulets used for purposes other than healing?
In the Christian repertoire, we do not tend to find, there is a very clear distinction in the Christian repertoire between healing, protection, prophylactic, and that includes, please help me when I go to see the emir, to pay my taxes. So, sorcery, curse amulets, which we find, or curses, which we actually do find amongst incantation bowls, are not common in the prayer amulet repertoire. I haven't found them in the handbooks that the priests are using, nor are, and you do find this quite commonly in, for example, a lot of Jewish material has prayer have amulets to excite love in another person. Those sort of categories are not really present. These I see as handbooks of healing, and that is why at Turfan they would have been used there, because it would have been, as you see, the 18th and 19th century, monasteries are places of therapy. So that's the sort of material that they use. And sorcery there is a very clear distinction about sorcery.
Great, thank you. Then Francis Matthew writes, I am from India. I have heard that that Christianity was spread to India too in the 1st century AD by Thomas the Apostle, and then from the 4th century Christianity was practiced there as Nestorianism. Is there any significant evidence that actually prove those incidents?
Well, that's another topic for a very different talk. Of course, the communities traditionally do believe that Thomas came, Thomas the Apostle, and I'm sure that he probably did, but I don't think it's a single stream entry of Christianity into India. But that's a very different talk to the prayer-amulets. But certainly there have been very, very ancient communities in India. And what is very interesting, and the Acts of Judas Thomas tell us that Mesopotamia, the valleys of Mesopotamia, were the road which these apostles, or some of them, travelled down to the Gulf of Basra, and then the natural sea route to India, or they travelled overland, and India in the Parthian times extended into what is modern Pakistan. So there are different routes and different people, but Thomas, of course, has a very special esteem amongst the communities today.
Thank you very much for that. And presumably those routes along which the amulets would also have travelled.
Well, the more we find, the more I'm interested in, but of course they're so fragile. And that's the incantation bowls being terracotta has survived because of their fabric. It's a question of, and paper. Now that's one of the interesting things that will date this material is paper really only comes into its own in the 9th century. I think I can't quite remember the date of the first paper mill in Baghdad, but it's in the Abbasid period. And one of the aspects that we did do with the Turfan material was get a paper expert, analyze the paper and looked at the fibers, and the plant fibers showed that that was Central Asian flora. And of course, the technology of paper went westwards. So paper really reaches the Middle East by the 9th century, and that's when vellum, because it's so much more complicated to prepare as a writing medium, falls into abeyance. Paper is the new computer, the new medium. So all the material at Turfan is paper. So, but it could be that, of course, the paper technology had reached Central Asia. We're in Western China, it was under the tongue, they had paper, so it could be earlier.
Great, thank you. That was a wonderful aside. Thank you very much for that. John Belts asks, where would a newcomer to this material get a further introduction to this tradition? From someone more familiar with the cuneiform and Aramaic incantation bowl tradition, for example.
Well, if he wants to write to me, I'll send him some articles. There isn't an overall book. There is Herman Gallantz's The Book of Protection, which he published in 1912, and people still use that as a manual. And what he simply did was translate the text of 3 codices, and one was a parallel to the 4th codex, which is in the British Library. So that will give you a taste of the text, but analysis and discussion, I'm happy to send articles.
Great, thank you for that. We, of course, await your book. Rosalind Wade-Haddons, thanks you very much for a fascinating talk. And then Reg Jargis says, I couldn't help noting the illustrations. They seem to share some similarities, but I cannot trace their style origin. Any comments?
Well, the illustrations are extremely interesting. Now, I'm not an art historian, but there are different schools. You can see there are the striped caps and the outfits, which look as if they're wearing Kurdish apparel, as the men did do. There must have been different schools, different regional variants, etc. I think now we don't have any illustrations from Turfan. They're not illustrated. One has the cross of the Church of the East on, but otherwise they're aniconic. And I think, and it's only a thought, there is no evidence on which I ground this to date, that they probably arise in the 16th, 17th centuries, and it looks to my eye of a Persian influence, but I'm not an art historian.
Thank you.
But they are fascinating, and of course the writers say, you know, in all the different guises. But of course the incantation bowls do have illustrations on, but they're entirely different to what is happening in the prayer amulets.
Thank you. Natalie May, her second question. Were there amulets hanging in the house to protect it? And what is Ishtar's in Syriac?
Well, I'm sure there were amulets hanging in the house to protect it. They would have, protection of the house was so important. I mean, it was the economy. But we don't have examples of that, but possibly the communities would have historic memories of how they used this material. So some social anthropology would be very good. There's a young chap who is now, he's Australian. I actually examined his thesis from Sydney. He's now up in Mardin and of Assyrian extraction. And I know he's done a lot of field work amongst the communities, what they call the Assyrian communities, who of course are the communities of the Church of the East, which older scholars have termed Nestorian. He's done a lot of field work amongst them, and I've tried to persuade him to turn his very fine thesis into a book, but he seems hell-bent on doing all sorts of other things, which are very interesting. But this would be very interesting. You need someone who has an introit to the communities, who can talk with them, because of course they were dislocated in the early 20th century. But I'm sure there must be some memory amongst the communities that people know what their grandmother did or something like that.
And there was a second part to that question, which was around the term Ishtars, and what that is in Syriac.
Well, it would be Ishtar. They use the term Ishtar. Ishtar is a generic term that you find in incantation bowls. It just means a sort of a demoness, and they use it in the plural, and there are it becomes this generic term becomes personified by the end of the first millennium into the demoness par excellence, who is renowned for killing infants, etc. So she's particularly malevolent. But the term would be Ishtar in Syriac.
Thank you. Jennifer Broom writes, you mentioned the existence of amulets and bowls in Armenia. Would they be much earlier than the 18th and 19th century?
That's an interesting question. Of course, these are connected with the Syriac communities, the Church of the East communities who relocated due to the vicissitudes when the Ottoman Empire was disintegrating. Many of the communities relocated, and as you can see from that, or you could see from that map, the Caucasus weren't that far away. They would be in the libraries. I don't think they're earlier than the 18th, 19th centuries, but what would be interesting, and it's not my field, but could be something that's explored, is whether, and I'm sure they did, the Armenian communities wrote their own repertoire of prayer amulets. I have no doubt. This is a vernacular practice that I think crosses territories, but I don't know, I really can't say whether there's a direct influence from the Syriac onto the Armenian or vice versa, but I'm sure the Armenian communities wrote, and of course they would have had a similar concept of demoniac possession. It was a very widespread concept, still is.
Thank you. A few more questions. Bernard Kilroy says, one can see how the amulets fit into the Manichaean and Zoroastrian culture. How would they have been imbued by official Islam, early and late? And were they closely associated with Christian monks and more so with local Christian priests?
Well, as I said, the Christian priests on a vernacular, local level wrote them, that they were part of the indigenous culture. And of course, they call upon the great figures of the ascetic tradition, Antony, Arsenius, who are the founders of monasticism in Egypt, and monasticism takes root in a very, very dynamic way in northern Mesopotamia, but its Egyptian origins are recognized or remembered. And then, of course, you have great figures of the church. So they are very deeply embedded in the memory of the great, the great traditions of the church. There would be possibly a tension with perhaps senior clergy, but I don't think it's as pronounced as we might imagine. I think what happens is that with and I don't want to, I'm not criticizing the European influence per se, but the fact is that Europeans arrived in these communities with great sort of altruistic motives, and they saw as part of the Enlightenment period that prayer amulets were part of superstitious practices, which of course were anathematized, were considered anathema in the Enlightenment. So these influential European missionaries and travelers who had contact with the senior officials of the church could well have influenced their ideas. It would be very interesting to know how they influenced them and what they actually thought. And I think there could be a dual level happening, as often is the case, where you have people adopt certain ideas, but they also continue the old traditional ideas, and it can sometimes, they do coexist. So I think that there's certainly would have been some official opposition in the 18th, 19th century, but earlier than that, it's very difficult to know.
And a question really that again sort of touches on sort of the relationships between different faiths from Lars Lahmann in regions where the religious traditions overlap, such as medieval Turkestan. Is there evidence that patients and families use Christian, Buddhist, and Muslim amulets simultaneously for greater efficacy?
I'd love to find that evidence. And I'm sure if a person was ill, you'd try anything. You have to try and cure. I mean, we do have the examples, as I said, of and it's still until very recently, and it was a very important element of interfaith dialogue, something that is forgotten in all the panoply of interfaith dialogue is on the local level, that people would go from different religious traditions for healing. I have one student who came from Urmia some years ago, and he of course was Muslim, and he told me that when he was a little boy, his mother took him to the well in the church, which was no longer functional, and said, if you drink this water, it will be efficacious for you. So there is this dynamic that's really interesting and also very powerful for cementing bonds between communities. And that's just an isolated example. So I would love if there was evidence. And of course, there were Manichaeans, there were Buddhists at Turfan. We just don't know how much they interacted with the Christians who were there. We do know, of course, there were Christian communities, Uighur and Sultan. How numerous they were, we don't know, but there were Christian communities. But what the local interaction is, unfortunately, we just don't have the insight.
Thank you. And I think just to finish the questions, it's really some information from Natalie May, which brings us back and connects your 18th, 19th century amulets with the great long tradition of Mesopotamia, where she says, she asked her question because she's actually dealing with the so-called error epic, written of course on cuneiform clay tablets, which took amulet form and were hung in houses for protection. And she was interested in the comparison of Ishtars in Akkadian. It is Ishtaratu in plural. And so she was just interested to know how Ishtars as plural sounded in Syriac in order to compare with that.
Well, if you'd like to write to me, I mean, I would think that would be Ishtare, and we certainly have plural Ishtars in the Aramaic bowls, and this translates into the Syriac.
Thank you very much. And Bernard Kilroy very rightly points out that I didn't come back to part of his question, which was really how these practices would have been viewed by official Islam.
Well, Islam has a very rich repertoire in its own right. When I was at Nippur and Matt Gibson excavating the incantation bowls, and the workmen, the Shagatis were there, and he said to the Shagatis, Hada jinn, those are the demons on the bowls. One of them had a beautiful little illustration. Of course, they were very interested. Fortunately, the text was clear as newspaper and you could read them quite easily. They were remarkable condition. And all of the workmen said to Mac, we are wearing amulets pinned to our clothing, but they wouldn't show. And there's a very, very rich tradition within Islam. I think that these traditions transgress, as I say, the verbal actions will remain conservative, but the loan words, we might say, the loan names change. And of course, they will call on the names of the names of God, or there'll be Quranic verses. And certainly in the repertoire of bowls, you have a category of bowls that ceramic and later on brass, which are incantation bowls. Now, again, the tension exists between what officials might say and what is practice on the ground.
Thank you so much. So I think that brings us to the end of the questions. So Erica, I just want to really thank you for this extraordinary, informative and stimulating lecture. Before we went live, as it were, you told me how much you loved your amulets, and I think that much is now very clear in this wonderful talk. Your enthusiasm is absolutely infectious, and I'm sure we're all now eager not only to read your articles, but also awaiting your promised book. So I hope I haven't put too much pressure on you for that.
No, I certainly do. It is one of the big projects in my mind, and they are such a rich expression of the people.
And I think that's what's been so wonderful and come so clearly, that the real humanity and the real personal faith that they express. And also, of course, those wonderful connections. I won't ever forget now that Solomon had a bad back as a result of his building work. So with much appreciation, thank you for this wonderful talk. And as I say, I'm only sorry that we're unable to hear the applause that should accompany that as we end tonight's talk. So thank you very much.
It's my pleasure, my great pleasure. And thank you, Paul, and BISI for inviting me. And if anyone would like to write to me about any aspect, I'm very happy to correspond and send
thank you
PDFs.
Very much. That's very generous of you. And to everybody in our audience, the BC webinars will be taking a short break over the summer for a couple of months, but we're aiming to be back to start a new series probably in September. So I hope very much you'll tune in and join us then. And of course, we hope very much that among these lectures we'll also be restarting our regular public talks in person back at the British Academy our home territory. So as Hookie Walker actually pointed out in his last comment, we hope that there's an anti-COVID incantation that Erica will find for us. So
maybe I could write one and sell it and make a fortune for myself and BISI.
Oh, well, perfect. Thank you very much. We certainly welcome that on all counts. So thank you, Erica, and thank you all for your attention this evening. And for the moment, good night.
Okay, we'll say good night. Thank you.